Hello and welcome to another episode of Nuzlocke Analysis. This time going over my personal favorite Pokemon Slaking and its applications in an in-game Nuzlocke context. This time I won't go too much into the details on the groundwork of this series. You can see the details in the description because it takes a fair bit of time to explain the rationales here, or alternatively my first video of this series on Pyroar, it explained the groundworks in the beginning. But here let's get started with Slaking itself. One of the first things to begin with before getting into the more hardcore plus details is that Gen 3 in-game was pretty amusing for Slaking in terms of two factors. One that is still there to this day, switch mode, and the other, how Truant interacted with using items from the bag. Most Nuzlockers aren't going to most Nuzlockers in a hardcore fashion, they're not using items from the bag. That's one of the fundamental rules. But the baseline Nuzlocke can permit it, and so it's worth discussing. Specifically in Gen 3, if you used an item from the bag on Slaking during its Truant turn, that counted as the Truant turn, which means you could essentially mitigate the drawback of Slaking's Truant by attacking in its regular turn and using an item in its second turn. With the ability to use X items to set Slaking up and the ability to use healing items to heal Slaking, you essentially had no issue with Truant at all. There was no turn economy loss. Being able to either recover HP or set up a stat is good enough that you don't need to attack every single turn. However, in later generations, that was obviously patched up so that using items from the bag does not count as a Truant turn. The other thing, switch mode, is around to this day. In a hardcore Nuzlocke, people play by set mode, and even in Gen 9 when set mode isn't available in game, you just say no to the switch mode prompt each time. And switch mode in general mitigates this problem in that Slaking can just take a KO and switch out, and it also has synergy with Giga Impact, which generally, although it leans on the Truant mechanic of not being able to attack each turn, unlike with Truant, Giga Impact prevents you from switching out normally, but it doesn't prevent switch mode prompt from allowing you to switch in your other Pokemon. So that makes Slaking far more valuable in switch mode, as you can just take a kill and freely switch out to something else. For hardcore Nuzlockers that play in set mode, this isn't as relevant, but we can see that even without these advantages, Slaking has plenty of merits going on for it in an in-game context. Now, now that we've got that out of the way, the one of the main aspects of Slaking that's essential is like the immediate value you can get from the Pokemon. We all know about Truant being one of the most hindering abilities in the game, allowing you to only attack every second turn. However, even despite this drawback, if you look at the sheer numbers of Slaking, it has the power to give you enough immediate value depending on how you use it, that that the drawback is less of an issue. Because if you think about it, doing the difference between if you can KO the opponent in one move, and you are faster, then they lost a turn of making progress. And if you have a Pokemon that is weaker than Slaking, it outspeeds but only does 90% damage, It's not KOing, it's taking a hit back, and then you need another turn to KO. In Slaking's case, if it can do the KO, the drawback is less apparent, and it becomes quite an interesting game, especially in competitive, where slacking is overall not worthwhile whatsoever. In later generations, it's consistently not good in the lowest of tiers, but in a game-to-game basis, you can get value out of slacking if you use it correctly. And there was even some instances of slacking having some pretty solid value. One of the examples I recall is this forum uh, back in the day in Gen 6 OU, talking about a normal spam team that peaked an OU suspect test ladder with slacking. And although this is for a Nuzlocke context, the ideas here are pretty helpful. That yes, slacking has its exploitability, but if you look at it, it reaches an amount of damage output that can even beat out Mega Medicham in some cases if you go all in on Adamant Choice Band. And that sheer wall breaking power to to take down the mons that otherwise deal with your threats. In this case, it was quite relevant because of the poster of this team who peaked needed a way to wall break through the super bulky Pokemon that deal with Megalopony, and slacking after Stealth Rocks happened to position itself really well for that purpose. And Slacking's overall numbers and stats means it can switch in, take some damage, do very relevant, and then get very relevant KOs. In this, in the competitive case, one of the main deviations is that the move Retaliate became very good, because the idea was you would bring in Slacking after one of your mons get KO'd for the free tempo and get a very high value damage output from there and switch out on the next turn. But in a Nuzlocke setting, Retaliate comes up less because you don't want to have your own Pokemon faint unless it's pretty relevant for your safety. So in some cases, you could use Retaliate, but in a Nuzlocke setting, if you want that consistent high power without having to be forced to stay in like Giga Impact, pre-burning, slacking, and then using Facade, which becomes 140 power, is the way to go, because many times you can just burn slacking before a fight and then enter. You don't need a flame orb. You can use whatever item such as a choice band, and with the cost being that if you burn, you can only use Facade, since your other moves, they're going to be halved, because Facade doesn't care about the attack drop of burn. So if you need to use other moves in that battle, you would have to pre-poison, which means you're taking 1/8 damage each turn instead of 1/16, which is the burn damage from Gen 7 onwards. So there's a trade-off factor there, but the idea stands that you can use it for that massive immediate value. And another thing is, slacking does have a drawback in that either you have to burn a Truant turn after you attack, or you have to switch out. That's pretty exploitable when you're playing as a player, although sometimes that isn't the worst thing if you can assess its value based. So the example being that suspect ladder OU peak, that was pretty impressive for slacking standards. there's that, but in game there's also the fact that you have a more defined understanding of the AI teams, their composition and the counterplay they have, what they would bring in after you KO something with slacking. Based on the Switch AI of the game, that can be pretty well defined. Another thing is fundamentally, the Switch AI of Pokemon games, they try to bring in something after one of their mons faints. They try to bring in something that would have a counter to yours. The vanilla games, their AI is a bit lacking in this, and that they just go in terms of maximum, in terms of highest uh, battle highest base power of the move multiplied by the type effectiveness, and not even accounting for stab. So that can have an idea on what Pokemon would be the best equipped to dealing damage against the Pokemon you have out, but it's very limited, of course. Sometimes the Pokemon they bring in could be something your Pokemon easily KOs, but other times it really could be something that forces you to switch out. Specifically, for example, in the recent Romhack Run and Bun, a difficulty Emerald Romhack, one of its highest priority switch AI case is that if one of the AI's Pokemon out can outspeed your Pokemon and can one hit KO it, that has the highest priority to switch in. And in a case like that, where if the team composition is good enough that the trainer has a well balanced enough team that any given mon that you're trying to sweep without setup moves, which in a hardcore plus rule set would be banned, uh, any any Pokemon, assuming they have the proper counters preventing you from just 6-0ing a fight, you're going to be prompted to switch out fairly quickly. For example, let's look at Raticate, which I mentioned pre-status strategies a while back. Raticate can reach similar damage output. Raticate can reach really high damage output, almost to the level of Slaking, if it's running the 140 power facade with a pre-burn Guts choice band. This can one-hit KO a lot of Pokemon. So the idea is that you could theoretically spam Facade and just 6-0 an entire fight. But against a more well-built team that has counters, this is harder to do. Like, for example, you can one-hit KO anything, you can one-hit KO mostly anything that doesn't resist normal with Raticate on your first move. But then the opponent will bring out their Mienshao, which is faster than Raticate and can easily one-hit KO given its bulk with a high jump kick or another or a close combat or a move like that. Then Raticate is forced to switch in. In that case, it doesn't really have a relative advantage to Slaking that had to switch in. And the difference between the two is that Slaking has overall better numbers. It's a bit faster, it's much bulkier, so you can bring it into a fight better than Raticate. So there's a reliability in that sense. If you need slacking to one hit, if you need slacking to take down very targeted specific threats, it really does that job well, better than a bunch of other Guts Pokemon. This is why, for example, most Guts Pokemon in Emerald Kaizo weren't as good at slacking. Swellow was overall deemed better than slacking, but Zangoose, Raticate, Ursaring, so forth, they were overall not deemed as good as slacking because of the many other factors at play that made it not so straightforward to just gut sweep everything. And another aspect of this, in terms of in terms of what makes slacking more rewarding and interesting to play, is that fundamentally, given its traits, it's a Pokemon that you very rarely will be using to 6-0 teams. Sure, sometimes you can even get by with a slack off tank set against certain teams if they can't dish out enough damage, given Slacking's level of bulk and access to recovery. Even despite only being able to move once every 2 turns, there's a possibility in certain fights where the combination of Giga Impact, Slack Off, and Leftovers can just 6-0 fights. But this is rare. This is rare for like fairly well built AI teams. They would have ways to make a more limited strategy like that not an easy 6-0. So most of the time, Slacking is going to get those very high value kills, but it's going to switch out, and that's what makes Slacking compelling. In that you're using it for precision, you're getting burst value out of it. You're figuring out when to position it uh, so to get the most value of putting it on your team, and supporting the rest of your teammates against a certain battle, rather than relying on it as your fundamental win button for the battle in its entirety, which sometimes you can do with a guts Pokemon like Raticate, assuming the proper counters isn't around uh, to check it. But yeah, that's part of the thing that makes Guts pre-status Pokemon less interesting to use, because either you have a window, you can have pretty easy windows to 6-0 fights if there's not the proper counterplay. But with Slacking, it's more of a piece in your team that helps you out. You get value out of it, uh, and that outweighs the costs of and drawbacks of Slacking, and it can help your team out in general more than it can hurt you if you use it properly. Using Slacking involves a fair bit of planning and damage calculations. Sometimes you want to you because Slacking is pretty configurable in the kind of moves and held items you use for different purposes. You want to maximize the value of Slacking because you can only hit once every 2 turns. You often have to switch it out, switch back in. So um, there's a bunch of trade-offs to consider between different moves and items to optimize the use of Slacking for a given fight. But yeah, that's the more fundamental aspect of Slacking. In a while, we'll go over some of the more details on different sets and their trade-offs, and some of the different contexts that allow Slacking to flourish and give it more and make it rougher for Slacking. But for now, the next part, we gotta compare Vigoroth and Slacking. Because, yeah, you're going to be using Vigoroth at some point in as an intermediary before Slacking. But there's also the consideration of, do you want to keep Vigoroth instead of Slacking, or do you want to go all in on Slacking? Depending on the context, Vigoroth could be the way. For example, in some Gen 3 Nuzlocke, even before Eviolite existed, which gives Vigoroth more of a reason, because you can look. Because if you look at its defense, it's 196, Slacking is 236, with an Eviolite boost in an EVless context. Vigoroth has, how much is that? 294 defense compared to Slacking's 236. So if you take Slacking's multiplication of defense and HP, 104,076, you divide it by 301, divided by 196 and divided by 1.5, Slaking in an EVless context amounts to be about 18% more physically bulky than Vigoroth, which is still a decent bit, but that means that Evaluate helps bridge the gap. Slaking's massive HP is a thing, and but because of how math works without just base stats but also other constant factors, the gap in terms of bulk between the two physically becomes not too far apart. So there's that aspect. But even before that, in Gen 3, there were reasons to favor Vigoroth over Slaking, especially in a non hardcore plus rule set where you could use setup moves. Vigoroth and the Slaking line overall, of course, get Encore, and it has access to setup and bulk up. So in Vanilla Emerald, for example, there were many cases where you could set up a scenario where you encore the opponent into a move that isn't useful for them, and then set up bulk up, sweep from there. In some other games, encore AI has been improved a bit, so it's a bit less exploitable, but Encore is still a fairly valuable move overall. And Vigoroth has the advantage of having a bit more flexibility with Encore because it isn't locked to only attacking every other turn. The and that helps with slack off as well. You can have a pretty solid bulk. You can have a pretty solid support line with Vigoroth's various support moves, that some of which it has an advantage over Slaking, especially when it comes to setup. So there's that aspect. But in a hardcore plus rule set where you don't have access to setup moves, Vigoroth's strengths over Slaking is less apparent because you don't really need the opportunity to get bulk ups if you're not even allowed to use bulk up the move. But nonetheless, being able to capitalize off of Encore, which is a very useful move, I'll use Run and Bun again as the example, where its way of using its AI for Encore is that the AI Pokemon, when it's locked into an Encore move, it will switch out if it if it can't really make progress with that move, such as hitting with an immunity. And similarly, more recent generations of vanilla games have a logic like that, where if the Pokemon can't really make progress and it's locked to a certain move, it's going to switch out. But even then, you can still get quite a bit of value out of Encore because they're normal types which means they have a ghost immunity, which is a big deal. You can switch into a ghost move. If you're faster, you can encore them, and then that turn they have to use that ghost move again, making zero progress. Then the next turn, the opponent is going to switch out because their ghost move doesn't do anything, which gives you a free turn to do whatever you wish to do, such as switching out to a more favorable matchup, which can also be like a more elaborate way to emulate switch mode. Like for example, they bring in a Pokemon that you would like to swap your matchup, and they're going to hit you with a ghost type move. You can switch it in Slaking or Vigoroth. Use Encore, lock it in, and then they're going to switch out. If you know the game's switch AI, in vanilla games, I really explain the gist of the AI, and in something like Run and Bun, there's a bunch of uh, there's a bunch of logic. Radical Red has its own logic and so forth. Many Romhacks, they do give you an idea of what their switch AI is, so you can have an idea of what they're switching in after after you encore lock them, and you can switch, and then you can switch out accordingly or get a free attack. And if you are switching out, since you basically know what they're going into, it's like you're playing on switch mode when they're using a ghost type attack and you're faster to encore them. It could be a similar thing with status moves again, such as if they spore, you pre-status your Pokemon so it can't get spored, and then you encore them, forcing them to switch out, and you can get a safety switch like that. So that is very valuable encore, even when you can't abuse it. For setup sweeps, has very important pivot applications. And in that sense, Vigoroth can have some advantages because you have more reason to stay in if you use Encore. But in the case where you're switching out after using Encore to get more pivot value, even sometimes not even just resists, just a normal attack, you might want to Encore them in so that you have so that they use an attack that's weaker on your mon than it would otherwise be, such as they're using, you know that you have like a fire type Pokemon, they're going to use a water move. You switch into your Slaking or Vigoroth to take that water move. You encore them uh, so that they continue being locked into that water move instead of maybe they would have gone for a fighting move super effective against you. And then you can switch out to your water resist that will resist that water move and have additional turns where the opponent is going to continue using a water move against you. And because it's just a regular resist, if it's a regular resist, they might not be prompted to switch out. I know that in the Poke Emerald expansion AI, I believe that if it's a quad resist, the moves, if the best move is quad resist, it will be heavily deprioritized, leading to a smart trainer switching out. But for a regular resist, that shouldn't happen. And in that case, that can give your water resist mon some pretty good leverage. And so in that case, when you're using it for more, when you're using it just for raw switching out potential, Slaking is technically better than Vigoroth Encore wise uh, because it's faster, it takes hits better. Though in the case of special defense, let's just calc this. We know that Slaking is about 18% more physically bulky than Eviolite Vigoroth, but how about specially? So let's see, 146, 219, 301. So Vigoroth is about 65, 9119, 9119, Slaking, and then times 1.5, 98,878. So when then Slaking, 66 divided by 301 divided by 146 divided by 1.5. Okay, so Slaking is about 11% more specially bulky than Eviolite Vigoroth as well. So yeah, that's so in both physical and special bulk, Slaking still wins, and it's also faster. So when it comes to switch out to Encore approaches, Slaking does beat Vigoroth. And in terms of overall damage output, Slaking has greater value than Vigoroth. But Vigoroth does have value in terms of encore, yawn, slack off shenanigans. So you can't write off Vigoroth entirely, but depending on what purpose you need, slacking might overall give the more solid value. In that you probably have mons that can fulfill Vigoroth's role about as well. And Slacking's role is harder to come by in that the sheer value of these stats when you use them correctly, there's not a whole lot of Pokemon can replicate that. Of course, on the screen you can see Palafin, which we talk about later. So after the more general comparisons of Slaking and Vigoroth, we're going to use this as a way to segue about EVs. First with Slaking Vigoroth, and then with other Pokemon as well. We're so one of the aspects of EV. Let's look at it offensively. Let's compare Slaking and Vigoroth in an EVless context, power-wise. If you look at the base stats, Slacking's base attack is twice Vigoroth's. But when it comes to math, that's not exactly how it works because IVs, EVs are a factor, and non-HP stats have a +5 constant to every Pokemon, which means that even in a 0 IV context, Slacking would be in a 0 IV context, Slacking would be slightly less than twice as strong as Vigoroth, 165 to 325. And yeah, in that case, Slacking is about 1.97 times stronger attack-wise than Vigoroth. But then when we go to max IVs, because you're adding constant values to both Pokemon, the higher initial stat is going to have a lower payoff, so the gap between these two narrows a bit. Instead of a 1.97, a 1.96 or such, the gap becomes such that Slacking is only 1.82 times stronger than Vigoroth, which is still a lot, but considering double the base stat, that thins it out a bit. And then when we go to EVs, that will narrow the gap even more. Where 419 versus 259 goes to Slacking being only 62% stronger than Vigoroth, which, given that massive gap in base attack, isn't as big of a gap. So as you can imagine here, the relative value of Slacking is higher when in a no EVs context, because Slacking's biggest selling point is its attack, and you want its high base stat, its overall high base stat total, and high base stats by extension, and you want to capitalize off that. But EVs, because they add constants, mean that the relative value of base stats lower, so Slacking becomes slightly less relatively valuable when EVs are in the mix. This is relevant because some Romhacks have EVs, some don't have EVs, some have the option of both, some have the option between having EVs or not having EVs, and this is a very important nuance to keep in mind. In the Pyro video, I leaned on 252 attack EVs for Pyro, specifically because Pyro's attack stat is so low that if you want to get value out of Moxie, then you kind of need to EVs to make the 68 attack stat not as bad. And in Slacking case, it's the opposite, where it's probably one of the best Pokemon in a no EVs context. So we looked at that in terms of relative value here. It's similar to that with Raticate, where let's look at Guts Facade Raticate versus pre-status Facade Slaking. Slaking they're both running choice band in this, let's assume, so that's equalized. Slaking has 356 attack, Raticate has 198. If you multiply the Guts boost of 1.5 to it, that goes to 297. So 356 over 297 amounts to Slaking being about 20% stronger than Raticate in a no EVs context. And then in an EVs context, 419 divided by 261 divided by 1.5. That amounts to Slaking being only 7% stronger than Raticate when it comes to EVless, when it comes to with EVs. So we can see that relative difference. That makes Slaking's power value less of a big deal when you have Raticate getting pretty close to it, and some other Pokemon such as Swellow with a higher attack stat than Raticate, or Obstagoon, those getting far closer or even surpassing Slaking when EVs are in the mix. But that's just in terms of relative power. We have to also take into account how it factors into factors into damage calculations and the overall net gain of power or bulk. So for that, let's take an illustrative example. Not this in this case. Let's take Gallade and Gengar. Now we can look at it in the sense that EVless, let's look at how it pairs up. Life Orb, Gengar versus Gallade. When no EVs are in the mix and you're using a Gengar Life Orb set, you can't guarantee a KO against Gallade because its HP is not that high, but its special defense is really good. And in an EV-less context where Gallade isn't forced to invest in its bulk in order to reap the benefits of its bulk, it results in cases like this where even a powerful move such as a Gengar Life or a Shadow Ball isn't a guaranteed kill. However, when we go into an EV context, you have to look at how that Pokemon would invest those EVs. Gallade would usually be max attack, max speed, and Gengar would usually be max special attack, max speed. And in this case, Gengar easily OHKOs Gallade, because Gallade can't really afford to invest defensively most of the time, because that's just not the kind of Pokemon Gallade is. Though there might be some cases where more defensive base Gallade. There might be some cases where a more defensive base Gallade could have its relevancy. But let's see here. Yeah, with the primary set being a 250 attack, 250 speed, there is some sets such as Bulk Up, but Bulk Up is obviously fairly different. But for a standard Gallade attacking set, you want to go all in on attack at speed unless you need to specifically tailor for a matchup. But theoretically, if Gallade went all in on bulk, it could take it could take a shadow ball better than an EVless context. And that's the general idea here, where Pokemon that would not be incentivized to invest in bulk are bulkier in EVless than in EV context, but Pokemon that would incentivize all their EVs into bulk are less bulky in EVless compared to an EV context. And that's pretty relevant in the case of Slaking, because Slaking being also hit and run, if you're in an EV context, you're pretty much forced to go all in on attack and speed, which means that its defensive merits don't shine as much. And conversely, because of EVs, the really bulky Pokemon, such as, let's say, a max defense, such as, let's say, I don't know, max defense Toxapex, Pokemon like this, which would go all in on the bulk, Slaking would do less damage in an EV context compared to it having zero EVs, and these Pokemon having no defense investment. The trade-off, however, is that this means that Slaking is better against offensive Pokemon, can do more damage against offensive Pokemon that would not invest in defensive EVs. However, Slaking has a damage output of such insane level that, for example, it can OHKO. It has the potential to one-hit KO a non-plus defense nature Mew in EVless if it's pre-status choice band Facade, which is certainly something it can't do in an EV context against a max defense Mew. Max defense invested Mew, not even close. And that is a big aspect here, where because of Slaking's damage output is so high, it benefits from the really bulky max defense Pokemon being less bulky, and the offensive Pokemon that aren't that bulky to begin with. They're bulky enough to take some hits, but certainly not as super Slaking's nuke hits. Slaking does overall gain benefits in that regard. However, that's not completely straightforward, in that if you're taking a Silk Scarf return approach, I'm going to go into my spreadsheet for my Romhack. I have a tab for damage calculation stuff, and that's relevant to some extent here. So let's see here in Silk Scarf return, if you want a bit of information on the numbers, this is roughly equating it to a Mew in terms of bulk. So a value of 0.58 here means that this would do about 58% to a Mew, and it would also be able to KO a Pokemon that is about 58% as bulky as a Mew. And I do have some numbers on the side for physical and special bulk for my various Pokemon. But as that aside, let's look at Slaking Silk Scarf return in an EVless context. It has the potential. It has the potential to. It has the potential to almost guarantee an OHKO on a pretty meager bulk Pokemon such as Simisear. But naturally, if this is an EV context, return would be able to pick up kills on a larger degree of Pokemon that are just slightly that aren't particularly bulky. The Simisear isn't completely frail, but it is not notably bulky. Simisear is like 75-63, which is on the higher end of frail side. And so like a mon like that, Silk Scarf Return in EVless doesn't completely get the kill. Like, sure, a Choice Banded full on Giga Impact or Facade is more than enough, but when it comes to optimizing slacking for different conditions, there are different trade-offs between held items and moves, so you wouldn't always just go for a choice band and strongest attack. So in some cases, EVless can be a benefit, allowing you to use lower drawbacks, simpler moves such as return that doesn't require you to pre-status like facade, take recoil like double edge, or have to be forced to switch in like Giga Impact. So I'm not saying that slacking is completely better in EVless, but when you look taking that, but for cases like that, there is an advantage of EVs if an EV context, as a 252 slacking would be able to hit harder against offensive Pokemon that aren't that bulky. But with slacking, the main aspect is the ceiling, the power ceiling. So, and because it has options to KO mons like that as is, the advantage of being able to KO more of the higher bulk mons because they don't have the privilege of going max HP, max defense, is good. And another aspect of this EV thing is when we look at its bulk. Let's take a look at Ferrothorn. This thing is one of the poster's childs of bulk. But in an EV-less context, slacking can take physical hits significantly better than Ferrothorn. If you do a simple multiplication of HP and defense, which is of course not completely sound, but it gives you a rough idea. You'll get, when you multiply slacking HP and defense, you get 104,076 Ferrothorn, and then you divide by its HP 289, and its defense 298, and you get slacking to take hits take physical hits about 21% better than Ferrothorn when it's not resist and it's just neutral hits, or equivalent super effective hits such as fighting attacks. Slacking's HP and defense in EVless is monstrous. It can take physical hits incredibly well. It has a physical bulk higher than Ferrothorn, Toxapex, Bastion even. It's not quite on the level of, say, Rhyperior, of course, but it's very up there. And in EV context, where you have to go max speed, max attack, the slacking's bulk lags behind compared to a mon like Ferrothorn, which maybe you'll go Rocky Helmet max defense. And in this case, let's see, what does the math amount to? The math amounts to Ferrothorn being 22% both more physically bulky if you go all in. So that's the difference. In EVless, slacking is about 21% more physically bulky, but in an EV context, Ferrothorn, when you go all in defensive, it can be 22% more physically bulky, and because of slacking's traits, you're not really going to go 252. That's just not an efficient use of slacking, especially when Truant is in the mix. You kind of are boxed into max attack, max speed. And then we'll go into slacking's main other weakness, so to speak, other than Truant, is its lower special defense. Even then, it's not that bad, because let's look at something like Wheezing, which is overall pretty solid defensively. It can take, in some tiers it's known as being a pretty reliable defensive sponge with those stats. Slaking's special bulk with 150-65 is around the same ballpark as Wheezing's 65-120 physical bulk when it comes to EVless. So it's functional. It can be a bit rough in some cases, such as how slacking, such as how, let's take an example of a Mega Alakazam. Let's take an example of a Mega Alakazam slacking, and it's using Focus Blast. So, assuming we have equivalent natures, such as if Mega Alakazam is special attack, then you plus special attack, then you're plus special defense. There's a 43% chance for Mega Alakazam to OHKO with Focus Blast, which means you're more favored than it isn't to survive. But still, that's a bit rough. But if it's a plus speed Mega Alakazam, then your plus special defense, your plus special defense slacking could guarantee survive. But because the Alakazam's speed is so high, then you probably would go with mod that. It would probably be reasonable for an AI set to go modest Alakazam to capitalize on the sheer power of its damage, but it depends on what Alakazam has to deal with. It might need plus speed to deal with, say, a plus speed Dragapult, but it depends on the context. But yeah, when it comes to a modest Alakazam, Slacking's special bulk, it could be a bit better to make it slightly better. So let's say if it had a base 75 special defense, that would help it a fair bit and give it some well appreciated level of bulk in the special side as well. And regarding this, I think it's funny. If you look at Vigoroth Slackoff, if you look at Vigoroth and it has special attack and special defense. Even Slackoff is also like that. But Slacking is skewed on the special attack compared to special defense. I imagine this was another attempt to make Slacking not as broken as it could be by leaning more on its special attack so that the overall value of its base stat total isn't that high. But I think personally it would have been cool if Slacking were 80 special attack, 80 special defense, and that would be a significant increase in its special bulk. But even then, Slacking having a bit less special defense is fine. It's got some solid special. It has okay enough special bulk to do the job. Better than most other Pokemon you'd be comparing it to, like say Obstagoon or other gut stuff like Raticate. It's fine. It does its job. It's on the lower end of good special bulk, while on the physical bulk, it's kind of on like the godly end. Slacking's physical bulk is insane enough that sometimes you can even justify a leftover slack offset, despite being able to move only once every 2 turns. And now that we have that in place, we're in EVless, let's look at Mega Medicham, because the original example I brought for him is that it talked about Slacking's damage output being even higher than Mega Medicham, and that was in an EV context. But in an EVless context, that can be seen even more. Where let's see, we've got Mega Medicham 236 with pure power. That's doubled, so that's 472. compared to Slaking 356 if you give it a choice span to go all in. 356 times 1.5 over 236 over 2. So that goes to being 13% strong. That goes to being 13% stronger, seems like. 36, 356. Let's just double check that again for 236. Yeah, 13%. But then you have to also consider that facade versus high jump kick. High jump kick is 130. Facade has the potential to be 140, and if you take that into account over 130, that amounts to 22%, about 22% better damage output. And you could go even further if you want to go Giga Impact, where with Giga Impact that amounts to being about 30% harder than Metacham's high jump kick. So, let's just say overall, let's take the facade case, where Slaking is 20%, about 20%. It hits 20% harder than Mega Metacham's high jump kick. It's more than 20% more bulky than Ferrothorn physically. Its special bulk is on the level of Weezing's physical bulk, and it's got a pretty solid base 100 speed stat. When you take all that into account and consider that in a Nuzlocke in-game setting against a competent or difficult team, you're going to be switching out a lot. When you look at all those merits, the cost of having to switch out after a hit isn't as high, because in many cases, other Pokemon would likely have to switch out as well. We bring in an Obstagoon, and the opponent sends in their Mach Punch Conkeldurr to completely destroy it. And so then the Guts Sweep with Obstagoon, it has to terminate itself. It can't sustain, so that the advantage of that becomes null. Now, another detail, I mentioned a lot about pre-status strategies, but in Generation 9, as far as I'm aware, and all battles and gyms, they auto heal you before the start of the fight, which means pre-status strategies wouldn't work in a context like that. And similarly with Run and Bun, it does healing before any fight in a gym, but you can do pre-status strategies outside of gyms against standard trainers or other boss fights. And reducing that means that Guts Pokemon, and in that context, Guts Pokemon are kind of forced to run Flame Orb, so they can't go all in on that choice band power, which means that Slaking has another relative damage advantage in that context. So when we have that, although Slaking's output is a bit weaker as well when it can't go choice band pre-status facade, and from a relative standpoint it wins out because its double edges with a choice band are significant enough compared to a Flame Orb boosted Pokemon. An example being Zangoose, which regularly is the strongest of the Guts and similar damage output while still having functional speed. Ursaring, Ursaluna, they're contenders as well. Ursaluna would be like the strongest a Guts user can be, but it's slow, so it can't capitalize on that as well. Zangoose it can, and in a pre-status context, Zangoose's damage output, even in EVless, 235 times 1.5 is 352 compared to, let's see, so yeah, even Zangoose, that's interesting. So no, this is 0 IV, that's one. 266. Yeah, so 266 times 1.5 over Slaking's 356 means that Zangoose is 12% stronger in an EVless context, with the cost of 10 less speed, lower bulk, and so forth. But that's pretty significant when pre-status is allowed. But when pre-status is not allowed, you're going Flame Orb. You're going Toxic Orb in Zangoose's case, since unlike Guts you can't use Burn. So you're going Toxic Orb, Toxic Boost, Facade, compared to Slaking's Choice Band, and that evens out. You wouldn't use Facade on Slaking in that case, but you could use, say, Double Edge, and Slaking's 356 times the 120 of Double Edge, if you divide that from Zangoose's 266 and 140, you're getting about 15% more damage here. So relatively compared to Guts users, Slaking does take the edge when pre-status is not feasible. But Slaking gains from pre-status as well, giving it a good facade. And now, with that out of the way, let's go on to some optimizations of hit and run strategies, where you bring in Slaking, KO something, switch it out. Obviously, as I've already mentioned, Facade is the main, where pre-status Facade is the main avenue to go if you need that reliable maximum damage while still being able to switch out. A choice banded Slaking pre-status Facade neutrally has the potential to KO Pokemon up to around Mew level of bulk. And if you can afford to go Adamant instead of a plus speed nature, you can go even further in the amount of mons you can OHKO. But depending on the scenario, a choice banded Double Edge can do the job as well. A choice banded Double Edge, as we can see here, is about the same power as a Silk Scarf Giga Impact, which has an 87.5% chance to OHKO a plus defense Blastoise, which means it's a guarantee against a non-plus defense Blastoise. And Blastoise is a solidly bulky mon, as we can see in that it's about 85%. So a mon that's about 86% physical bulk of Mew, which is a pretty solid standard when it comes to measuring bulk, because let's say, for example, Toxapex is just slightly better than Mew physically, and Ferrothorn is as well as is a moderate but not too significant amount more physically bulky than Mew. So that Mew is a solid benchmark for that. And in this case, a Silk Scarf Giga Impact or a Choice Banded Double Edge, it can do the job if you can't pre-status, or you don't want to pre-status because in another part of the fight you might want to pick up a KO with an Earthquake or an Ice Punch or a Hammer Arm. an Ice Punch, Earthquake, Hammer Arm, Hammer Arm. There's just a bunch. Slaking has a bunch of physic moves that operate as a pretty solid, powerful nuke against a given mon. And it's possible even in some sequences that after taking enough damage from slaking in a fight, from pivoting it in, you can end it off with a reversal at low HP and getting that insane damage output. So in that regard, there are some cases where maybe you don't want to pre-status slaking, especially because if you pre-burn it to lower the damage you take from the status, you lose the burn attack drop affects all the other moves. So unless you're going mono facade, you're going to have to pre-poison, and that's 1/8 damage per turn, which is hefty on slakings. The amount of time slaking can go in. So when you can afford a double edge or a return, it might be able to help if you have greater flexibility against other options with Earthquake, Punches, Sucker Punch, or so forth. So there's a solid amount of optimization on that part, where you can look at different configurations. Silk Scarf is good as well, and specifically more so in the case where you're staying in, which most of the time you aren't doing, but there are some reasons to stay in, or some reasons where you can take like a Giga Impact, afford to stay in, and then KO with a Silk Scarf return, or a Earthquake or something like that, get 2 kills before selecting has to switch out. There are cases you'd have to look at the damage. I've done a lot of slapping damage calculations, but of course, if we were going over every single one of them, it would take an eternity for the various different kind of cases that could come up. But in general, we just know that you can mix up the options depending on the kind of damage output you want to put out. Usually you choice band, sometimes maybe Life Orb, which can do additional chip damage, could be the play. Sometimes Silk Scarf, and sometimes if you're not going all in on the damage, you can go you can go no item or leftovers or something like that, which still you can guarantee no KO on a mon such as Nidoking, or of less bulk than Nidoking. There are quite a few mons that just slacking Giga Impact with no boosting held item, you can still beat. It can still KO Pokemon of average to lower bulk. So there are some cases where you can justify using that. And then now, those are just like the hit and run fundamentals. We also have to bring up the cases where you're not switching and slacking immediately after turn 1. And when this is into consideration, this means you're interacting more with Truant. When you're just getting a KO and switch, Truant is less relevant in the sense that if you're KOing something switching out, it doesn't matter if Slack and you're comparing it to another Pokemon that was doing the same thing in the context, like the example of a Obstagoon when this next Pokemon is a Mach Punch Conkeldurr that forces you to switch out. That cost is eliminated, but when you go to multiple turns, that is trickier. I've seen in Blip Exists video on why slacking is fundamentally flawed in competitive Pokemon. He brings up that aside from the cases of getting that immediate KO value, you could partly think of slacking as having halved stats because it's because you're taking 2 hits for every hit you deal. But that's not exactly how it works either. And an example of that is comparing it to Snorlax. Let's say we're in a scenario where where Slaking and Snorlax are both 2-hit KOing an opponent with their stab attack. And let's say that the opponent has a speed stat lower than Slaking's base speed, higher than Snorlax's base speed, which is a very wide threshold. Between 30 and 100, the majority of Pokemon fit into that range. And in that case, let's look at it. So if Slaking is 2-hit KOing, Slaking goes first, it outspeeds. It takes a hit. Truant Loaf, it takes 2 hits, then it KOs on the 3rd turn. And in a case like that, you would probably want to go Giga Impact followed by Return, Silk Scarf. This is good enough to KO almost most Pokemon neutrally. Like, you could take on possibly even an Avalugg bulk Pokemon. Let's calc that quick. Where Avalugg's got an insane amount of bulk. Silk Scarf, Giga Impact, not Giga Drain, Giga Impact, Return, 102, back Return. Yeah, with this, there is a chance of a 2-hit KO Avalugg, and especially because Avalugg is slow, you could even choice band, you could even animate it. Though I guess Avalugg isn't the best example since it's slower than Snorlax. But yeah, the principle stands. If you have a Pokemon that is faster than base 30, that is really bulky, that Slaking, you would generally be 2-hit KOing with Slaking. Suicune. Let's look at Suicune. Yeah, like, let's say a max defense Suicune. Well, by max defense, we're doing EVless here, so a bold Suicune. Where a bold Suicune where we could do something like this, where Giga Impact Return, 2-hit KOs, you take 2 hits. And similarly, with Snorlax, if you're 2-hit KOing at Snorlax and it's slower, they hit you, you attack, they hit you, you attack, and then you KO. You're taking 2 hits. So in the case where Slaking is faster, it's not that its base stats are halved, it's more that it's like equivalent to it having the ability Stall. It would be almost like Slaking 2-hit KOing with the ability Stall, which funny enough is ability that it's given to Slaking in some Romhacks and stuff. But yeah, in that case, and then we have to also keep in mind that unlike Snorlax, which is probably using Return twice to 2-hit KO, Slaking has Giga Impact and Return. That's 150 and 102 compared to one Return twice. That's about like 23.5% stronger going Giga Impact to Return than doing 2 returns, because Truant means that Slaking can Giga Impact first turn. You want to return second turn so that you can switch out if you need to. And then we have to also add that Slaking's attack stat compared to Snorlax's is 356 divided by 256. When you add that all up, when you add Slaking's 356 to 256, 356 to 256, then times 250, 252 from from Giga Impact and return over 204 from return. That can amount to Slaking's damage output when it comes to 2-hit KOing being about 70% stronger than Snorlax's because of its higher stat and its ability to use Giga Impact and return instead of just return twice. So when you take that into account, Slack, even when you're 2-hit KOing, you can get some solid value out of Slaking, because then it can almost be simulated as being a slow Pokemon instead of a Pokemon that has to have its base stats. Since that's not exactly, and since that's more of how it works. When it comes to 3-hit KOing, then your Slaking turn economy gets rougher. But honestly, there are very few Pokemon that Slaking can't 2-hit KO, and if it can't 2-hit KO on the rare cases, you're not using Slaking in that matchup. You're going to use it against another Pokemon on that trainer's team that Slaking can get value out of. So when it comes to either 1-hit KOing or 2-hit KOing, Slaking has solid value. And another comparison with Snorlax is that Snorlax does not have a reliable recovery move such as Slack Off, while Slaking does, so that even though it has to take 2 hits, Slaking could in some cases be more reliable as a tank against physical attackers than Snorlax is against special attackers, because it's forced to either use rest, which rest sets are pretty good when you have access to Curse, but in a Hardcore Plus setting, that's less of a thing. So that loses value there. Rest, you're taking 2 hits for free, unless you're relying on Sleep Talk RNG that's giving up a move slot. The alternative is Gluttony. Now, when it came to Gen 7, which had these pinch berries be 1/2 HP, then Snorlax was really good with Recycle, in that it could heal. It basically was like Slack Off, except you had to give up an item slot, healing 50% per berry when Gluttony's in the mix, because Gluttony makes it so your pinch berries, which would normally trigger at 1/4 HP, trigger at 1/2 HP. But in Gen 8 Plus, these berries got nerfed, so Snorlax would have to give up an entire item slot to get 33% HP per value from the move. Maybe not immediately, maybe later on, but overall, the value of using that move gives you 33% HP. And unlike Slaking, which can run leftovers if you're doing a tank set, Snorlax is boxed into its berry. So, in that regard, Slaking could have cases where it's about as good as a Recycle, Snorlax, or sometimes even better when it comes to tanking, when it comes to being a Slack Off tank. But of course, because of taking 2 turns, Slack Off isn't insane value. You can't just Slack Off tank every team, but you have to keep that in mind. Or it's about even with Barry Snorlax, and maybe better than Rest Snorlax, or depending on like the trade-offs of having to use Sleep Talk or not, and so forth. So that is a factor to keep in mind. Now, there are a few other things you can consider with Slaking. Like maybe there are some cases where you would Assault Vest so that it can pivot into special attacks better, if it has enough damage output as is. As we can see, if you're using a Double Edge or a super effective Ice Punch, Earthquake, hammer arm, something like that. Uh, uh, you could get some value there, and drain punch is cool as well. Super effective drain punch could be enough chip damage against certain mons, and could help sustain the assault vest a decent bit. Another funny one, another funny set is eject button. In an eject button slacking set, where you can do a hedge, where you can KO something with Giga Impact, take a hit, and then be forced to switch out, which makes the cost of Giga Impact a bit less. You're taking a hit, but it's similar to a Pokemon that's slow U-turning to, say, a Magnezone, where you use Volt Switch. You take a hit, you get a Volt Switch out. You're slower, get a Volt Switch out, switch into something for free, and you can get in an offensive Mon without having to take damage on it, which can be pretty good. And depending on the situation. And similarly, sometimes being able to Giga Impact and then getting a free switch from eject button, assuming you're faster, because if you're slower, then eject button can just mess you up. But otherwise, that can be cool. And it can also be funny in the case of uh, dual scenario between damage ranges. Maybe there's a case where you're using a return. You're just using a bare return that has a chance to one-hit KO the Pokemon, uh, or but it isn't guaranteed. You could use Silk Scarf to make it guaranteed, or you could use an eject button and then play the game of if if return does one-hit KO, you preserve your eject button, and you functionally it perform the same role as using a Silk Scarf to one-hit KO, and the advantage being you still have your eject button after securing a KO, which is relevant in the sense that in such a scenario you're switching out after getting a KO by yourself, but you're preserving the eject button, which is good in the sense that later on in the fight you can switch in your slacking against some stray hit, the eject button procs, and you can freely switch in another Pokemon, which means you get a free switch into something that couldn't afford to take a hit. And in a case like that, having an eject button could be of value. Most of the time, you're probably not doing that. You're probably using eject button with synergy with Giga Impact, but sometimes you could use it as a damage. You could use it for damage ranges and getting an additional bonus effect of your eject button in the case where you, because the idea is if you don't get the KO with a return, but you do enough chip, they don't get KO. They proc your eject button. You go into your another Pokemon that's fast and just takes the KO from there, and that would be functionally similar. And that would be functionally similar to KOing and getting an eject button switch out. So there's something like that where you can use it as a best case scenario. If you don't get the damage roll, you get a free switch to something that KOs. That was basically the same thing as getting the damage roll, maybe even better because you got a free switch into a Pokemon you wanted to position into the rest of the fight. And if you do get the damage roll, you can switch out and preserve that free switch for later in the fight. So it's cool. Eject button is cool in terms of damage range, in terms of like damage range hedging, but yeah, most of the time you probably are gonna have it as a funny synergy for Giga Impact, since Giga Impact doesn't allow you to switch out. So, taking that into account, now let's go into another thing that we kind of have to briefly mention. Palafin, the new that Pokemon in Generation 9, which is kind of like a more, which is very similar to Slaking and better in many respects. Same attack status Slaking, same speed as Slaking. The the HP is lower, so it doesn't. It, so in terms of physical bulk, it's not as high as Slaking, but it's still got some solid bulk. And we're looking at, and it even has the insane move Jet Punch, which is like a built-in Technician Aqua Jet. The cost of Zero to Hero is that Palafin has to switch out one time during a battle to move from its weak form to its strong form. But that's a very low drawback in a single setting, whether it be competitive or a Nuzlocke setting. So while Slaking's drawback isn't too bad, Palafin's drawback is so minimal it's not even a huge deal, especially when it even has, with its speed, you can even flip turn instead of hard switching. But even then, Palafin overall is generally better than Slaking. But even then, there is one aspect Slaking has in terms of its damage output. Palafin's best water move is your Wave Crash. Water physical move, since it's a physical dagger, is Wave Crash. That's basically a water type double edge. Slaking has double edge as well, but it also has the pre-status facade option. And so when you go 140 over 120, you have a 17% higher damage output with pre-status facade compared to Wave Crash. And Wave Crash is taking recoil, so similar to pre-status facade, resulting in you taking some damage. Wave Crash is making you take some damage as well. And even when we're just comparing Double Edge to Wave Crash, roughly they're essentially the same damage because they have the same attack stat and Double Edge is the same power as Wave Crash. But since Slaking has higher HP, it does at least still take less damage from Double Edge than Wave Crash. So in some cases like that, Slaking does have some advantages, but Palafin's traits are just way more significant. It's easily a much better Pokemon than Slaking and a Nuzlocke overall. And when it comes to competitive, the difference is insane because the difference is so much higher because Palafin is actually Uber's worthy, while Slaking is in like the bottom barrel of tiers. But yeah, that's just a slight remark on Palafin because that is the main Achilles heel mon to keep in mind. And then there's also Regigigas, has slow start. Nowadays, Regigigas has Protect, Rest. It got those in Gen 8. It didn't get those moves before then. It has those which helps it get over slow start a bit more. Especially in game, if the opponent doesn't have setup moves you have to worry about, Protect can help make the cost of slow start not that significant. But even then, they're on completely opposite sides of the spectrum. You have to go the sustain route with Regigigas to make it strong, while Slaking, you can just go all in on immediate value. And this is why, like, in competitive overall, because Regigigas has just got good bulk, it being weak at first isn't too bad, because even with just its bulk alone, it's alright. And then after slow start ends, it has a bonus of also having good speed and great and amazing attack. Regigigas overall in competitive is better than Slaking, but Slaking possibly has a better ceiling. You don't really see Regigigas doing insane things in OU because it requires many turns. But slacking, depending on what function you need your team to do and what roles, what counterplay the opponent has, slacking has the potential to do well even in an OU, to get high value in an OU context, such as that OU suspect forum I showed a while back. That showed the value of slacking when it's using that power to aid in the spam of megalopony. You can consider cases like that where slacking has value that other mons might not be able to. And then there's Archeops as well, which has its merits in power, but its moves overall are less reliable than Slacking's. Head smash is strong, but you miss a lot. Acrobatics hinders your item options, reducing your ceiling compared to Slacking. It doesn't get Brave Bird, but even if it did, Brave Bird would be a bit rough because it uh, feeds into Defeatus Recoil, and then that's another thing. Head Smash also feeds into Defeatus Recoil. Scott, it's Archeops is good in a Nuzlocke setting, and you use it to get those kills and get high enough value so that you position it so that the drawback isn't that big, but it just lacks this. But it does lack the ceiling of slacking. And then, now that we've got the main things out of the way, another thing to talk about is removing Truant. Because obviously slacking stats are insane. If you can get rid of Truant, it can have some insane value. There are many ways that it can be done in different contexts. Like, for example, in competitive, there was the strategy of taking like a Kofagrigus. It has Mummy. You switch Kofagrigus into a contact move, give Mummy to the opponent, makes Kofagrigus hold an eject button so that it immediately switches out, allowing you to pivot into your slacking, which then can throw in a pursuit to guarantee that you're contacting that Mummy Pokemon, even if it tries to switch out, and changing your ability to Mummy. And that gimmick strat allows you to get your full power slacking. And in a Nuzlocke setting, that kind of thing is slightly more favorable because you don't have to worry about AI predicting and switching out and exploiting, so you wouldn't really need pursuit most of the time, and sometimes you wouldn't even need eject button. You could just have Kofagrigus with Mummy, or Lingering Aroma, Oinkalone with Lingering Aroma, which is basically the same thing as Mummy. You could have those and just switch out manually, then use any free attack with slacking. It doesn't have to be pursuit because the AI is probably not switching out. So it's better in a Nuzlocke setting if you have that option available. So to say you've got an Oinkalone and slacking encounters at the same time. And then there's also stuff like neutralizing gas, where in a double battle you can use the Weezings to eliminate Slacking's ability, and the neutralizing gas also gets around Intimidate, so that in Slacking can just go hard in power. And most recently, we got another cool move in Doodle, which in double battles you can use it to copy an opponent's ability both for you and your ally, which means you can not only remove Truant from slacking, but also pick and choose out of two abilities something better to give to slacking. So that's cool. There's also skill swap strategies in general, there's this funny Emerald Kaizo Tate and Liza strategy that involves um, using pivots with pre-damage, baiting out the AI into certain moves to give you the time to position a skill swap into the Tate and Liza team's pure power metacham, and then skill swap that into your Slaking and go off from there. It's not more there are more efficient strategies to beat Tate and Liza, but there was a but the sequencing in that plan works is reliable enough, and it's just amusing to use to position yourself in a way to get a pure power Slaking and just tear through Tate and Liza that way, even though there are other very safe ways to beat that fight as well. But that's a more funny and creative way to get that done. So, yeah, overall, because the cost of Slaking isn't too high, you don't need to go all in on removing Truant. But because Slack Off is such a good move with stats of this caliber, reliable recovery when you have physical bulk 20% greater than Ferrothorn, that's something. A Pokemon like Dondozo, which is more physically bulky than Slaking, it it doesn't have reliable recovery, and that's what makes Dondozo balanced. So having Slaking that has this insane attack stat, Dondozo bulk, and slack off, as well as good speed, that's very valuable. It's just that you don't need it, but it could be funny to position a strategy to get rid of Truant, depending on the context and the situations at hand. Because you can definitely find cases where it's a it's a worthwhile strategy, especially because of the limitations of AI, of the trainer AI, and so forth. And for the last discussion point, I want to talk briefly about some ideas people have for buffing Slaking in Romhacks. Radical Red is an example which modifies Truant so that on the loafing turn you're free to use recovery moves such as Slack Off or Rest. This essentially means that Truant doesn't lose you turn economy. You're not losing anything in a given turn, but you're just being forced to attack every second turn. Against AI, this isn't too bad. In competitive, this still makes Slaking not that great, but against AI, that's pretty solid. But Radical Red has a lot of setup Pokemon, so giving them an extra turn where you can attack is still quite volatile. In like a more vanilla game where setup isn't that prominent, there's such an ability buff can go off, arguably being a bit too good for a regular vanilla context. I think, and I wouldn't do that buff myself because I'm not a fan of removing turn economy entirely. However, there's a way to help that a bit. For example, the Romhack Emerald Rowie has a modification of Truant that makes it so if the Pokemon used a recovering move such as Slack Off or Rest, the following turn, well, no, in Rowie's case it was specifically Slack Off, but you could extend it to being Rest as well. The following turn, you don't have to loaf. But if you do use a non-recovery move, you do have to loaf. So, for example, comparing it in Radical Red's case, you could do attack, uh, slack off, attack, slack off. But in the Rowie case, you could do attack, loaf, slack off, attack. And every time you attack, you have to loaf. So that's nice as well. That means you don't have the cost of that lowers the cost of using slack off. because they don't get a free move. They don't get two moves when you use slack off. But so it does give you a much higher incentive to stay in and get value out of slacking without being too free in terms of turn economy. So I like that kind of buff as well. It depends on the level of your Romhack. In my case, in my own Romhack, the power level is about vanilla level, so Truant doesn't really need a buff. If I needed the buff, I would go in a rowy approach, but because I don't, I prefer just keeping Truant as is, using Slacking's intrinsic properties as it currently is, and it's good enough. Really, the main buffs I do is give it better accuracy in some moves, such as I increase the accuracy of Giga Impact Hyper Beam. Many Romhacks do that. It's one of the most standard changes because these moves aren't that great to justify being 90% accuracy. They're only optimal in very specific scenarios. So that's why being 100% is reasonable. That also helps it overall. Because when you have only 90% Giga Impact, are you really going to go for a Giga Impact strategy when it's only a 10% chance to, when there's a 10% chance you won't even make any progress, especially given Giga Impact has a cost with Truant because it means you can't switch out the turn after you use it, unlike with Truant, which doesn't have that restriction. And I also did the thing where it made the special attack special defense 80-80, which I think is justifiable based on the design of Slackoth and Vigoroth sap spreads. I think it's could have been something that's reasonable, but it feels like Game Freak decided that they wanted to nerf Slaking a bit more in addition to Truant, which, to be fair, for an in-game setting, Slaking is good enough that it didn't need to be better because the default is switch, and in switch mode Slaking is really good, even better than in these hardcore plus Nuzlocke contexts. And then we have to also add in that in Gen 3 it was even more broken because of the items in battle thing I mentioned at the beginning. And then there's some Romhacks that give Slaking alternative abilities to Truant. Slow start, Regigigas's ability is given sometimes. There's some reasons they use this because unlike Regigigas who has to rely on rest as its main healing move, Slaking can slack off. So you can use slack off to help sustain those Truant turns and then just go off. There's also stall, stabilize, signature ability, which means Slacking stats are just overall great, but then it has to use them as a tank. It still works well with slack off. And that would mean Slacking speed is basically base 1, so it has a base, so it essentially has a base 571 stat total, which is still better, which is still higher than than no drawback Pokemon. So stall Slacking can also be pretty good. Defeatist Slacking could be funny as well, in the sense that Defeatist is giving up, Slacking is lazy, so you could justify it giving up as well. And with slack off, you can help mitigate those weaknesses. And that's the interesting thing. A lot of these other abilities, they can be mitigated a bit when you have good bulk and reliable recovery. So Slacking can arguably use these abilities better than most of the other Pokemon. Sableye is and Sableye doesn't even have a reason to be nerfed. It's more of a flavor thing probably for giving it a stall. But yeah, that's the general idea with these buffs. So to end this video off, there's quite a few avenues with Slaking. I didn't go over the nuances of different damage calculations because this video is already insanely long, almost 2 hours as is. But there's a lot to think about with Slaking because of the limitations put in. It's a Pokemon that you want to position in, plan correctly, use in the right cases, um, so that it can benefit your team, and that the benefits of using it outweigh the costs of it. So So that's why I like Slaking. It's not a Pokemon that you're just going to reliably 6-0 easy teams with, but when you use it right, when you put in the effort and judge the right context in which Slaking's strengths are beneficial, it can be massive value, especially if the power level of the Romhack is lower level, and especially if the limitations of the Romhack are greater, such as with Emerald Kazo, you have barely no access to setup options, and the opponents can go really high in offensive pressure. You have like a Latios that can Draco Meteor without reducing its special attack, and instead just getting recoil. That can stuff of that power can like really chip down other high power mons such as Guts Toxic Boost users that don't have the bulk Slaking has. And especially in an EVless context, Slaking's relative value is higher, and it's even more pronounced if you're not guaranteed high max IVs. In 16 IVs, the principles brought forth is even more significant in terms of the relative value. Like a 16 value Slaking, a 16 attack IV Slaking compared to a 16 attack IV Guts pre-status Eradicate, the power and the relative value is in Slaking's favor because the lower your IVs are, the more base stats take prominence. So when we look at many different contexts, many applications, Slaking's roles overall are pretty straightforward. It's doing a lot of damage, but there's a lot of details to that, a lot of different configurations, a lot of trade-offs when you look at it compared to Vigoroth, where even though Vigoroth has some advantages when it comes to Encore or Yawn or something, Slaking being having that bulk in the case of Yawn, or having Encore and like having that speed in the case of Encore, and especially that while Vigoroth is less bulky even with Eviolite, if you're doing an Encore Slaking set, you could possibly even run leftovers with that and help give it that bulk advantage to give it another reason to outweigh Vigoroth. So there's some interesting things in that regard. Just shows that when you have numbers like these, there are ways to get around your drawbacks. And with that, signing off.